Thank you very much. So yes, I'm Mary Simon Martin. I'm a Marie Curie Fellow at the Department of Humanities, and basically my research project will consist of turning my PhD into a fully fledged monograph. And I will be carrying now this 2-year project here in the Department of Humanities in collaboration with the School of Education in Roehampton University. And as my title, this is my PhD title, suggests, my research explores letters as educational instruments for literate middle-class women in the context of 19th century England. And I study letters as educational instruments via the study case Barbara Bodichon, who was a mid-Victorian English feminist, philanthropist, and artist. Barbara led a rather nomadic lifestyle, living between Algeria and England, and constantly traveling across Britain, continental Europe, and northern Africa. Obviously, letters permitted Bodichon to be in constant contact with family, friends, and acquaintances. But beyond its purely communicative use, my suggestion is that letter exchange also worked as a social and psychological instrument. Letter writing forged bonding and networking. It facilitated knowledge exchange. It functioned as an emotional and intellectual outlet for self-expression. It served as a source of self-understanding, and it stirred up action. As such, my suggestion is that an apparently anodyne, feminine daily gesture actually functioned as sources of education in the life of Barbara Bodichon. Education in the sense of Bildung, which is the lifelong process of self-cultivation. So as Bildung-like instruments, letters acted as platforms where Bodichon acquired and shared knowledge, exercised her critical thinking, forged her identity, and worked out her autonomy. Not only during her education years, properly speaking, that is during her home education and schooling, but throughout her life. In the process, letters provided Bodichon with a forum where challenging, reappropriating, or sometimes simply adopting circulating discourses, including discourses on bourgeois femininity, she articulated in letters her feminist subjectivity, and she carved out her individuality. So my project is an interdisciplinary approach to history in that it incorporates to the history of women's education methods and theoretical instruments from the philosophy of education, narrative analysis, literary studies, and gender theory. So from the philosophy of education, I borrowed the term Bildung, which is, as I said before, the lifelong process of becoming culture, gebildet. And this process takes place in interaction with the outer world. The gebildet individual undergoes a process of creative mimesis, in which she distances herself from her beliefs, she interacts with other people's perspectives, and she incorporates this difference into her own sense of being, but in a critical fashion. This process of self-alienation and creative mimesis takes place in interaction with people, within social relationships. When communicating with people and discussing each other's perspectives, the similarities create a friction that, according to Bildung theory, prompts self-fashioning, prompts this self-alienation and critical thinking. In this sense, traveling, according to Bildung theory, offers a great opportunity to be exposed to the difference that emanates from the diversity of the world. And ultimately, Bildung requires of individuals to turn their individual thoughts into self-determining action, because autonomy is the cornerstone of Bildung. So taking this theoretical framework, my suggestion is that Bodichon's epistolary conversations reflect the essence of Bildung, that is the lifelong intersubjective process of self-formation. It is by means of communicating by letter with other people, that Bodichon not only maintained a reciprocal, transformative interaction with them, but she also articulated her working out of the Bildung process of knowledge acquisition, self-alienation, creative mimesis, and self-determination. Notwithstanding, in philosophy of education, Bildung is a term that is being criticized today for its classist and masculinist bias. So in line with these criticisms of Bildung as a power apparatus, my suggestion is that Bodichon's epistolary Gebilded self can be read as illustrating the twofold conceptualization of power proposed by Foucault, simultaneously oppressive and productive, as well as exemplifying his notion of resistance. That is, my suggestion is that Bodichon's epistolary Gebilded self is an effect of power in the sense that it was articulated within discursive regimes. It's also oppressive in the sense of Foucault's understanding of power, in that in her letters she contributed to reinforcing and circulating prejudices against certain social categories. And I'm particularly interested in her understanding of working class women and native women. But I'm also saying that Bodichon's epistolary Gebilded self also was the locus of agency. She somehow challenged and reappropriated, but above all challenged gender understandings of what was to be a bourgeois woman. And she managed to, when you take into account her whole epistolarium, she managed to develop her own Bildung. Narrative analysis is a transdisciplinary method of qualitative research that takes experience as the unit of analysis to study and understand social phenomena. Lived experience can be verbalized or written in autobiographies, diaries, personal correspondence, just ordinary day-to-day conversation, photos, family albums, in many visual and textual documents. And what narrative analysis does is to study these documents, textual or visual, as narratives. And what is a narrative? A narrative is the process of subjectively making sense of your lived experience. So my project is a narrative analysis project in that I read Bodichon's letters as narratives, as forums where she made sense of her life, where she created sense of her experience. She attributed meaning to the events she lived through. She established order in these events, creating a sense of causality, unconsciously or consciously, and in the end she managed to make sense of what happened to her. So epistolary narratives obviously are conditioned by the audience. They are mediated by memory, also mediated by the social codes of letter exchange, and they are articulated within historically and culturally bound discourses. But my suggestion is that nonetheless, epistolary narratives permitted her to exercise at least her textual agency. Within narrative analysis, there is a particular approach that borrows two theoretical terms from literary studies that I particularly find very productive. These terms are emplotment and genre. Emplotment refers to the act of assembling historical events into a story with a plot. And genre are the categories in which the literary works can be classified. In my study of Bodichon's epistolary Bildung, what I examine is how Bodichon emplots her epistolary narratives, that is, how she makes sense of her experience by mobilizing discourses into fragmented personal stories, letters, each letter. And I also study how the genre of letter writing, the social codes of letter exchange, and the ontology of the letter itself enable but also condition this emplotment. And finally, I borrow from gender theory the concept of performativity as proposed by Judith Butler. According to Butler, gender is not a reflect of an inner self, but it's an effect, it's not a reflect of an inner self, but an effect of incessant, reiterated acting. So drawing on this concept, my suggestion is that letter writing is not a reflect of a self that exists prior to the act of self-narrating, but it's an effect of this act, signifying act of self-narrating. It's a performative, autobiographical act constitutive of the self. So on that account, Bodichon acted out her identity through the signifying practice of letter writing via her epistolary eye, in dialogue with a myriad variety of correspondence that determined, this audience determined her performative articulation of herself, and always within the social codes of letter exchange. Ultimately, she produced herself, at least partially, by means of this epistolary mechanism in an ever-unfolding process. And my suggestion is that each letter is a snapshot of this process of identity performativity or this self-development. To sum up, my feminist interdisciplinary research project seeks to understand the exercise of female agency within patriarchal structures, discourses, and practices in 19th century England. And I do so in two ways. Firstly, by studying informal sources of education for middle-class women at a historical period when, in general, bourgeois women received a rather precarious home education. Their schooling insisted on learning the codes of sociability and etiquette, had limited access to further education, and were formally excluded from higher education. Secondly, I tease out the implications of Bodichon's development of Bildung. By means of a critical redefinition of Bildung, my project seeks to tease out how Bodichon developed her self-cultivation on occasions at the expense of certain social categories, namely working class and native women. Thank you very much. Thank you.